The heavy oak doors creaked open as I stepped into the courtroom, and for a moment it felt like every pair of eyes in the room had been waiting for me. My heels clicked against the cold marble floor, each step echoing louder than it should have, like a drumbeat announcing the condemned. I am Camille Ross, 31 years old, a high school English teacher who has spent a lifetime being overlooked, but in that instant as I entered the room where my father's will was being contested, I was no longer invisible. I was the enemy. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, laced with the scent of old wood and paper, mixed with an expensive perfume I recognized immediately. My mother's signature, Chanel sharp and cloying. I barely had time to breathe before she turned toward me, her lips curling into a smile that did not belong in this sacred space. Helen Ross, my mother, 60 years old and always ruthless when it came to appearances, let out a sharp laugh. Not a gentle laugh, not a nervous laugh, but one of open mockery. Her voice carried through the chamber, cutting the silence like glass, shattering on tile. "She thinks she's worth something now," she said loud enough for the judge, the lawyers, and the sea of relatives packed into the pew-like benches to hear. The words hit me harder than any physical slap. My face burned, but I forced myself to keep walking, to keep my back straight. Behind her, I caught the smirk of my brother Michael, 34, in his perfectly tailored suit, leaning back as if this were just another real estate deal he had already closed. My younger sister Sophie, 25, dressed like she was headed for a photo shoot rather than a legal proceeding, lifted her phone slightly, her eyes glinting with cruel amusement. Was she recording me? The thought sent a chill racing down my spine. My relatives murmured among themselves, a low tide of whispers rising, as I approached the table where my lawyer sat waiting. Some shook their heads, others covered their mouths, as if this entire scene were entertainment, and they had front row tickets. The laughter, the whispers, the sharp stares, they collapsed on me like a wave I couldn't swim through. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might be audible. I had known this day would be brutal, but nothing had prepared me for the sight of my own mother laughing at me as though I were a joke. Every sacrifice I had made, every paycheck I had stretched thin to help her with bills every night. I stayed home grading papers while my siblings' chaste glamour meant nothing in that instant. The people who should have been my family had turned me into their spectacle. The judge adjusted his glasses, his expression stern but not unsympathetic, as if he too had registered the venom behind my mother's laughter. My attorney leaned in to whisper, "Stay calm, Camille. This is exactly what they want to rattle you." I swallowed hard, tasting the metallic tang of blood where I had bitten my lip. Stay calm. How could I when my own mother had just announced to the world that I was worthless? The air felt tighter pressing on my lungs as I slid into the chair beside my lawyer. I gripped the edge of the polished table so hard my knuckles whitened, my nails biting into the wood grain. For a fleeting second, I remembered my grandmother Dorothy's words spoken years ago when I was still a teenager, hiding from the chaos of my family in her kitchen. "Silence isn't weakness, my dear. It's strength waiting to be used." Those words whispered back to me now, faint but steady, as my mother's laughter still echoed in my ears. I forced myself to look up to meet her eyes across the room. If she expected me to break to cry to beg, she would be disappointed. I was here for more than their approval. I was here for truth. My name is Camille Ross, and if you had asked anyone in my family to describe me before this trial, they would have said I was the quiet one, the girl who never wanted much, the daughter who blended into the background so well she could vanish without notice. I am 31 years old, a high school English teacher in Vermont, the kind of person who spends late nights grading essays that no one will ever thank me for, and weekends helping students polish college applications while my own family pretends I don't exist. I am not glamorous like my younger sister Sophie, whose entire identity is built on perfectly filtered photographs and curated videos for thousands of online followers. I am not celebrated like my older brother Michael, who walks into a room and immediately becomes the star simply because he sells houses and drives expensive cars. I was the child who ate dinner quietly, who learned to listen instead of talk, who cleaned up dishes after meals, while the others moved on to their next spotlight. My father Richard, who has now passed, once said in front of relatives, "Camille is responsible, but not remarkable." Those words etched themselves into my bones. They were meant as neutral, perhaps even kind, but they became the script my entire family lived by. I was the dependable one. The one who would drive Sophie to her photo shoots when she didn't feel like taking an Uber. The one who would loan Michael cash when his real estate deals took too long to close. The one who would show up at every family event and still be forgotten. My mother, Helen, mastered the art of favoritism so seamlessly she didn't even pretend otherwise. She bragged about Michael's sales numbers at dinner parties, fawned over Sophie's brand collaborations on Facebook, and when it came to me, she would sigh and say, "Camille? Oh, she's just teaching like it was a hobby, not a career. Like the lives of my students meant nothing compared to Instagram likes or commission checks." But silence had always been my shield. As a child, I stayed quiet because speaking only invited ridicule or dismissal. As an adult, I stayed quiet because I thought maybe, just maybe, if I didn't push, if I didn't ask my family, might one day see me for who I really was. That recognition never came. Birthdays passed with perfunctory gifts, usually something impersonal like a gift card, while Michael and Sophie were showered with celebrations and expensive surprises. My college graduation was attended half-heartedly while Sophie's high school dance recital earned a banner across the front lawn. Even when I became the first in the family to earn a master's degree, my mother said only, "Well, I suppose someone had to do the boring work." Yet, despite all this, I still loved them. That's the cruelest truth. I wanted their approval, their acknowledgement, their pride. I stayed close, I sent money, I listened when they needed me, even when my own needs were dismissed. It wasn't weakness, it was hope. And walking into that courtroom, watching my mother laugh at me as if I were nothing, I realized that hope had been a mistake. They had never seen me, never valued me, never respected me. But this trial, this inheritance my father left in my name, would no longer allow me to remain invisible. For the first time in my life, silence would not be my shield. It would be my weapon. I sometimes wonder if the universe decided early on that I would be the shadow child, the one who lingered in the background while the spotlight belonged to my siblings. My memories of growing up are stitched together by moments of blatant favoritism so sharp they might as well have been carved into stone. I can still see my brother Michael's 18th birthday. Our father Richard stood in the driveway holding a key ring that glinted in the sun. "For you, son," he said proudly, handing Michael the keys to a brand new Mustang. The neighbors clapped. My mother cried tears of joy, and Michael strutted like a king, receiving his crown. I clapped too quietly while standing off to the side in my thrift store dress, holding the lopsided cake I had baked myself because no one remembered to order one. On my 18th birthday, there was no driveway ceremony, no tears of joy. There was only a single wrapped package waiting on the kitchen table when I came home from school, a plain wool scarf that still had the clearance tag half torn off. "You needed something warm for winter," my mother said flatly before rushing out the door to meet Sophie's dance instructor. That was the measure of our worth. Michael received a car. Sophie received endless lessons and praise, and I received practicality disguised as thoughtfulness. Sophie's 16th birthday was even grander. Our living room overflowed with balloons, banners, and a professional photographer snapping photos of her in her pink designer dress. She opened an envelope announcing her summer trip to Seoul, all expenses paid. My mother squealed like a teenager hugging Sophie and declaring, "My beautiful girl deserves the world." I was told to move the chairs and serve drinks to the guests, my presence no more significant than the plastic cups on the table. No one noticed when I slipped upstairs, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared out the window, while Sophie's laughter carried through the floorboards. It wasn't just birthdays. It was dinner conversations where Michael's smallest achievements were stretched into sagas. He sold a 3-bedroom house in 1 week. My father would brag, his voice swelling with pride. Sophie's newest video, reaching 10,000 views, was treated like a national holiday. When it was my turn to share about my students winning a statewide essay competition, my father interrupted to refill his glass. My mother changed the subject, and Michael smirked as if I had embarrassed myself just by speaking. I learned quickly that silence kept me safe. Every attempt to shine was extinguished before it could spark. I can still feel the sting of one particular night, my college graduation. I had walked across the stage in my cap and gown, the first in the family to earn a degree. My parents attended, but they were late slipping into the auditorium just as my name was called. Afterward, while my classmates hugged their families and posed for photos, I stood holding my diploma folder as my mother scrolled through her phone. Sophie just got invited to model for a boutique. She said, her eyes lighting up. Isn't that incredible? No mention of the diploma in my hands, no pride, no picture. Just Sophie's endless glow. Even when I earned my master's degree, the silence was deafening. No party, no banner, no congratulations. My mother shrugged when I told her. Well, I suppose someone had to do the boring work. It was always like that. Michael's charm excused his arrogance. Sophie's beauty excused her irresponsibility. And my reliability excused their indifference. I was the safety net, the spare tire, the one expected to show up when they needed me and disappear when they didn't. Looking back, I realize how deeply I internalized their version of me. The invisible one, the unremarkable one. I wore it like a second skin, and every time I dared to peel it off, they forced it back on with a laugh, a sigh, a dismissive wave of the hand. Those years should have broken me, but they didn't. They taught me something my siblings never learned: how to endure, how to survive without applause, how to build strength in silence. They thought they were burying me under neglect, but what they were really doing was forcing me to grow roots deeper than theirs could ever reach. In a family that treated me like an afterthought, there was one person who never looked at me with pity or disdain, one person who saw more than the quiet, invisible daughter everyone else dismissed. My grandmother, Dorothy Bennett, my father's mother, was 85 when she passed, but in my memories, she is ageless. She carried herself with the kind of dignity that could silence a room without a single word. Her voice was steady, her hands weathered from decades of tending her garden, and her eyes sharp enough to cut through every false smile and hollow compliment my family loved to perform. I spent more time in her kitchen than I ever did in my own living room. The smell of her apple pie became my anchor, the soft tick of her grandfather clock, the only rhythm that ever made sense to me. While my mother bragged about Sophie's online followers or Michael's newest property sale, my grandmother would sit me down at the kitchen table and ask, "And what about you, Camille? Tell me what you're working on." No one else ever asked. When I told her about the novels my students wrote or the poems they recited, she listened with tears in her eyes as if those victories belonged to me. "Don't you see?" she would say, her voice trembling with conviction. "You give people words. That is a gift more lasting than money or fame." One night when I was 17, I broke down in her kitchen after Sophie had been given a birthday party that could have been mistaken for a wedding, while mine had passed with nothing more than a shrug. I remember slamming my hands on the table and whispering, "I don't matter to them. I never will." My grandmother took my trembling fingers in her strong, wrinkled hands. She looked at me with eyes that did not flinch and said, "Silence isn't weakness, my dear. It's strength waiting to be used." Those words branded themselves into my soul. She explained that people like Michael and Sophie, who constantly demanded attention, were fragile in ways they didn't understand. They needed validation to breathe. But I, she said, carried power in my quiet persistence. "One day, Camille," she told me, "your silence will roar louder than all their shouting." Before she passed, she left me something far more valuable than any trinket or heirloom. In her last days, when she could barely lift her head from her pillow, she asked me to take a small wooden box from the top drawer of her dresser. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, faded and frayed at the corners, filled with her looping handwriting, and tucked between pages were documents I didn't understand at the time, letters from lawyers, notes about my father's business, and a single taped envelope with my name on it. She pressed the box into my hands and whispered, "Keep it safe. One day it will protect you." I didn't argue. I didn't even fully comprehend what she meant. But the weight of that box in my lap felt heavier than gold. After she died, my mother dismissed the notebook as old junk and told me to throw it away. I kept it hidden under my bed instead, a secret shield I didn't know I would one day need. Now, sitting in the courtroom years later with my mother's laughter echoing in my ears, I thought of that box. I thought of my grandmother's words, and I knew this was the day she had prepared me for. When my father, Richard Ross, passed away at 65, it wasn't unexpected. Years of heart problems had worn him down, and though he had moments of clarity and kindness, The truth is, his health had been fading for a long time. Still, his death cracked something inside me that I didn't realize could break. For all his flaws, for all the ways he had overlooked me, he was still my father. I had spent nights grading papers at his bedside, reading aloud when he couldn't sleep fetching water, while my siblings were too busy or too uninterested to show up. I thought those quiet hours meant something. When the lawyer called us together for the reading of his will, I walked into the office expecting nothing. Maybe a small sum of money, maybe a sentimental trinket, nothing more. After all, wasn't that the role I had always been assigned, the invisible daughter, useful but forgettable? My mother sat in the center of the polished mahogany table like a queen awaiting a coronation. Michael at her right hand in his pressed navy suit, Sophie at her left with her phone out already recording snippets for the curated image she called her brand. I sat at the end, clutching my notebook, prepared to endure another afternoon of being erased. The lawyer's voice was steady, deliberate. To my son, Michael Ross, I leave the lake cabin and a financial trust of $100,000. Michael smirked, already planning how he would leverage it for another flashy deal. To my daughter, Sophie Ross, I leave the Manhattan apartment and a trust of $75,000. Sophie squealed softly, her manicured hand covering her mouth in fake shock as if she had won the lottery. And then the lawyer turned the page. To my daughter, Camille Ross, I leave controlling interest in Ross Agricultural Holdings comprising 60% of the company shares as well as the family farm and all associated assets in Vermont. The words struck me like thunder. I blinked, convinced I had misheard. My mother gasped audibly, her chair scraping back against the floor. Michael froze, his smirk collapsing into something dark and dangerous. Sophie lowered her phone, her eyes wide with disbelief. The room fell into a silence so heavy it felt like gravity itself had shifted. The lawyer continued unflinching. Mr. Ross's will makes explicit that Camille Ross is to serve as trustee for the family farm and business with full authority over operations and decisions moving forward. My chest tightened. My father had chosen me. The man who once told me I was responsible but not remarkable had entrusted me with everything that mattered. For a fleeting second, I wanted to believe it was his way of saying he had finally seen me. But the moment passed as my mother's voice sliced through the air. "This is a mistake!" she shrieked, her face flushed crimson. Camille must have manipulated him. She never cared about this family. Michael pounded his fist against the table, demanding the will be reviewed. Sophie burst into tears, wailing that I had stolen her future. I sat there heart racing, caught between shock and an unfamiliar flicker of pride. For once, I wasn't invisible. For once, I wasn't forgotten. But I had no idea that this inheritance would not only ignite every ounce of jealousy my family harbored, but also drag me into a courtroom where my own mother would laugh at me as if I were nothing more than a thief pretending to be someone of worth. The days following the reading of my father's will were a blur of phone calls, accusations, and venom disguised as conversation. I should have been grieving. I should have been allowed to sit with my memories of him, flawed though they were, and process the loss. Instead, I found myself in the middle of a storm, whipped up by the very people who should have been my family. My mother, Helen, didn't waste time. She called me the next morning, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You think you can steal from your own blood?" she hissed. "Don't play innocent, Camille. You never mattered to your father, and you don't matter now. This will is a fraud, and everyone will know it." Before I could answer, she hung up. Michael was less subtle. He showed up at my apartment, pounding on the door until my neighbor threatened to call the police. When I finally opened it a crack, he shoved his hand against the frame and leaned in his cologne. Heavy, his smile cold. "You don't know how to run a company. You don't know how to manage a farm. Hell, you don't know how to manage your own life. Hand it over, Camille, before you embarrass yourself." His tone was smooth, but his eyes burned with entitlement. He truly believed it all belonged to him, as if being born first had earned him the right to everything. Sophie chose another tactic. She turned her outrage into performance. Within hours of the will being read, she was live streaming to her followers, tears streaking her perfectly contoured face. "My sister stole everything from me," she sobbed dramatically. "She manipulated my poor father when he was sick. She's trying to destroy my future, our family legacy." Thousands of comments poured in, strangers calling me a monster, a thief, a cold-hearted daughter. My phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications, each one more brutal than the last. I wasn't just fighting my family anymore. I was fighting the court of public opinion, and they had Sophie's curated narrative spoon-fed to them like gospel. I tried to reason with my mother once, calling her late at night when I thought anger might have cooled into reason. "Mom," I said softly, "Dad made this decision. I didn't trick him. I didn't push him. He chose me because he trusted me." There was a pause long enough for hope to flicker, and then her voice cut through me like ice. He must have been confused. "You are nothing, Camille. You always have been." She hung up again, and I sat in the dark of my apartment staring at the phone, the weight of her words pressing down on me like chains. Within a week, papers arrived. Legal papers. My mother, my brother, and my sister had banded together to contest the will. They claimed I had manipulated my father, forged documents, and coerced him into leaving me everything. They had hired one of the most aggressive estate lawyers in the state, a man known for shredding reputations in court. The headlines followed soon after: teacher accused of stealing father's fortune. Siblings battle over family business. My students' parents sent cautious emails asking if it was true. Some of my colleagues avoided me in the hallways, their eyes full of questions they didn't dare voice. It was as if my entire world had been painted with their lies. I felt cornered, trapped, but underneath the humiliation and fear, something else simmered. A quiet rage. They had taken my sacrifices and twisted them into weapons. They had erased my loyalty and painted me as a criminal. For once, I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to stay silent. If they wanted a war, I would give them one. The courthouse smelled of polish and stale air, a blend of disinfectant and something older like secrets that had been kept too long. I walked in with my attorney, Rachel Myers. My stomach knotted so tightly I could barely breathe. The gallery was packed, neighbors, family, friends, reporters clutching notepads and cameras. To them, this wasn't a family tragedy. It was theater, and I was the unwilling star. My mother sat at the opposing table, regal in her tailored navy suit, her silver hair arranged to perfection. She looked like a woman prepared to mourn her husband with dignity, but I knew better. Beside her sat Michael in his smug arrogance, his tie knotted perfectly, his Rolex catching the light. Sophie leaned against him, her phone tucked discreetly in her hand, no doubt ready to feed her followers minute-by-minute updates. Their lawyer, Stephen Caro, was a shark in human skin, his reputation built on destroying opponents in inheritance battles. His smile was thin, practiced predatory. The judge entered, and the room hushed. I folded my hands in my lap, my knuckles bone white. Rachel gave me a reassuring nod, but even she looked tense. I knew we were walking into enemy territory. "Your Honor," Caro began, his voice smooth and confident. "This case is about deception. It is about a daughter who manipulated her dying father, who preyed on his weakened state to secure wealth and power she could never have earned on her own." He gestured toward me with deliberate disdain. Camille Ross, a schoolteacher suddenly finding herself in control of a multi-million-dollar agricultural enterprise. Does that make sense? Or does it sound like fraud? Gasps rippled through the gallery. My cheeks burned, my pulse hammered. Rachel rose to object, but the judge allowed him to continue. Caro produced a stack of papers and handed them to the bailiff. We submit into evidence a series of emails in which Ms. Ross pressured her father to sign over control. She wrote that she would make sure Michael and Sophie got nothing if they ever crossed her. We also have a contract purportedly signed by Mr. Richard Ross transferring assets under suspicious circumstances just weeks before his death. The bailiff distributed copies. My eyes fell on the documents and my stomach dropped. The emails bore my name, my address, my supposed words twisted into poison. One line read, "Dad, if you don't give me the farm, I'll tell everyone about your affair." I almost choked. My father never had an affair. I had never written such vile things. Caro leaned on the jury box, his voice dripping with faux concern. "This is not the behavior of a devoted daughter. This is blackmail. This is coercion. This is fraud." My mother covered her face with her hands, shaking her head as if she were the victim. "She destroyed our family. She sobbed theatrically. She never loved her father. She only saw dollar signs. Michael took the stand next, testifying with feigned sorrow. Dad told me he was worried about Camille. He said she was too controlling, that she pressured him constantly. He wanted to change the will, but he was too sick. I begged him to reconsider. Sophie followed her voice, breaking perfectly on cue. She hated me, she cried, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She told me I was worthless, that I'd end up with nothing. She's always been jealous of me. Each lie struck like a hammer, nailing shut the coffin they had built for me. I wanted to scream, to stand up and shout the truth, but Rachel squeezed my arm, warning me to stay composed. Still, I could feel the eyes on me, friends, neighbors, strangers judging, believing the spectacle unfolding before them. Caro delivered the final blow. He held up the forged contract, my father's signature scrawled at the bottom. "This proves intent," he declared. Richard Ross did not willingly leave his fortune to Camille. He was manipulated, deceived, and cornered. The judge examined the papers with a frown. My heart sank lower with every second of silence. I could see it, the seed of doubt taking root in his mind, in everyone's mind. By the end of the day, my reputation was in shreds. Reporters hounded me as I left the courthouse, shouting questions. "Did you forge the documents, Camille? Were you blackmailing your father? How does it feel to rob your siblings?" Cameras flashed in my face as I pushed past them. My chest so tight I thought I might collapse. That night alone in my apartment, I stared at the stack of photocopied evidence Rachel had given me. My name was on those emails. My father's signature was on that contract. To the world it looked airtight, and yet I knew every word, every stroke of ink was a lie. I thought of my grandmother's box hidden beneath my bed. I thought of her words. "One day this will protect you." For the first time, I understood what she meant. But in that moment, sitting in the dark with tears streaking my face, I couldn't feel strong. I felt small, crushed under the weight of my family's betrayal, suffocated by the enormity of their lies. The silence that had once been my shield felt like a prison. I had spent a lifetime swallowing words, enduring, quietly believing it would make me stronger. But now silence seemed to tighten around my throat, and for the first time, I wondered if I would survive this war at all. The days after the courtroom debacle blurred together, each one colder and lonelier than the last. I had thought grief was unbearable when my father died, but grief had at least been quiet. This was different. This was humiliation made public, a parade of whispers and sidelong glances wherever I went. At school, the place that had once been my refuge, I felt the sting most sharply. A group of students who had always lingered after class to talk about books now avoided me, their eyes flicking nervously toward my desk. Parents sent terse emails to the administration questioning whether someone under investigation for fraud should be allowed to teach their children. My principal, once warm and supportive, pulled me aside one afternoon and said carefully, "Camille, maybe take a leave of absence until this clears up." Until this clears up. The words echoed like a death sentence. I walked out of the building with my box of belongings, the hallways unnervingly silent behind me. Even my closest friends hesitated. Leah, who had been my confidant since college, answered my calls with a tight voice. "Camille, I want to believe you, I really do. But the evidence? It looks bad." She didn't mean it to cut, but it did. It carved into the part of me that still hoped someone, anyone, would stand firmly in my corner. The loneliness was suffocating. I ate meals in silence, the clink of fork against plate filling the emptiness of my apartment. Nights stretched endlessly. I would lie awake replaying every lie my siblings had told, every forged word on those emails, until my chest ached and my breath came in shallow bursts. More than once I found myself curled on the bathroom floor, the tiles icy against my cheek, wondering if maybe my family had been right all along. Maybe I was nothing. Maybe I didn't deserve to fight. One evening, the cruelty of it all reached a crescendo. I went to the grocery store, trying to lose myself in something as ordinary as buying bread and fruit, when I overheard two women in the aisle behind me whispering. "That's her," one hissed, "the one who cheated her siblings." The other woman clucked her tongue. "Disgusting! Stealing from your own father." I froze, the apples trembling in my hands. I wanted to shout that they didn't know the truth, that they were swallowing Sophie's lies whole, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I left the cart abandoned in the aisle and fled, tears burning my eyes as I drove home in silence. That night, I pulled my grandmother's wooden box from beneath the bed. My hands shook as I placed it on the table. I hadn't opened it since the day she gave it to me. The leather notebook inside smelled faintly of lavender and dust, her handwriting looping across the pages in careful script. There were letters she had written to me, words of encouragement I had been too young to fully appreciate then. But tucked between the pages were the documents I had nearly forgotten: contracts, business records, notes she had scribbled about my father's affairs. And there, sealed with brittle yellow tape, was the envelope with my name. My breath caught as I slid a finger beneath the flap. Inside was a letter written in her strong, unwavering hand. Camille, it read, "Truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. This notebook holds pieces of that truth. Use them wisely. When the world calls you a liar, let the evidence speak for you." For the first time in weeks, something stirred in me besides despair. It was small, fragile, like the flicker of a match in the dark, but it was there. A whisper that maybe I wasn't powerless, that maybe silence, as my grandmother promised, could still roar. The letter from my grandmother stayed with me like a heartbeat. For days I carried it in my purse, unfolding it when the weight of lies felt too heavy, reading her words until I could almost hear her voice. It didn't erase the isolation or the pain, but it gave me a direction, a reminder that evidence, not emotion, would save me. I called Rachel, my attorney, and asked her to meet me at my apartment. She arrived late in the evening, her trench coat damp from the rain, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion etched into her features. I laid the notebook documents and envelope on the table between us. Rachel flipped through the pages slowly, her brow furrowing deeper with each sheet. "Camille," she said finally, This could be important. Your grandmother documented contracts, business dealings, even inconsistencies in your father's accounts. Look here." She noted dates when Michael filed papers for Ross Agricultural Holdings that don't align with the company's own records. "And this," she tapped a stapled set of notes, mentions a draft amendment your father refused to sign. "If we can match these against the forged emails and contract Caro submitted, we might prove tampering." Hope surged, then faltered. But how they look legitimate. My name, my address, everything matches. Rachel leaned back, her gaze steady. "Metadata. Camille, emails leave fingerprints. Even if they're fabricated, there are digital trails, timestamps, IP addresses, inconsistencies, and file origins. We need someone who can dig beneath the surface." That was how Anthony entered the picture. He wasn't a lawyer, but a former student of mine, one of the brightest I had ever taught. Back in high school, he had been the quiet kid who built websites for fun, who once told me, "Computers speak in whispers if you learn to listen." When I called and explained my situation, there was no hesitation. "Ms. Ross," he said, his voice warm but determined, "you believed in me when no one else did. Let me return the favor." 2 nights later, he came to my apartment with his laptop cords and an intensity that belied his 20-something frame. He scanned the email files Rachel had secured from Discovery. "See this," he said, pointing at the screen. "The emails supposedly sent from your account in March show a creation date of April. That's impossible. And this header, look closely, it routes through an anonymous server in another state. Someone faked these." My chest tightened. Proof. Actual proof. Anthony kept digging. Hours passed, the hum of his laptop filling the silence. At one point, he froze. "Here," he whispered. On the screen was the contract Caro had waived in court, bearing my father's shaky signature. Anthony overlaid the document against an older contract from my grandmother's files. Notice how the signature is identical. Not similar. Identical. They copied and pasted it. And look at the font on the date line. It didn't exist in word processors until after your father died. I covered my mouth, tears spilling over. They hadn't just lied. They had been sloppy. In their arrogance, they had left breadcrumbs. Rachel's eyes gleamed. "This changes everything. If we present this in court, the narrative shifts. We're no longer defending you're exposing a conspiracy." But even as relief washed over me, fear lingered. My family had already painted me as the villain. What would they do when I started dismantling their lies piece by piece? Anthony packed up his laptop, but before he left, he turned to me. "They thought you'd stay silent, Ms. Ross. They counted on it. But silence doesn't mean weakness. It means waiting for the right moment. That night, as I tucked the notebook and files back into the wooden box, I realized the tide was turning. I wasn't just fighting to clear my name, I was fighting to reclaim my voice, to prove that evidence never blinks, never bends to performance, never lies. And when the time came, I would let it roar louder than any accusation. The courtroom buzzed like a hive when I walked in, the press crammed into the back rows, microphones bristling like weapons. I felt the weight of their stares pressing against my skin, each one waiting for me to falter, to confirm the narrative Sophie had spoon-fed them. But this time, I wasn't coming empty-handed. Rachel walked beside me, her briefcase heavy with documents, Anthony trailing close, laptop tucked under his arm. For once, I didn't feel alone. Judge Harrison called the court to order. My family sat across the aisle, their confidence oozing. Michael reclined in his chair as if the outcome were already written. Sophie dabbed at her eyes with a tissue for the cameras. My mother stared straight ahead, her face carved from marble, cold and imperious. Caro smirked, his shark-like grin daring us to swim in his waters. Rachel rose. Your Honor, the defense is prepared to present new evidence regarding the documents and emails submitted by the plaintiffs. Caro leaned forward, scoffing. Objection stall tactics. We've already established the authenticity of our exhibits. Sit down, Mr. Caro, the judge said firmly. I'll allow it. Proceed, Ms. Myers. Rachel nodded to Anthony, who connected his laptop to the courtroom projector. The screen lit up with lines of code headers and timestamps. Murmurs rippled through the room. First, Rachel began, her voice steady. The plaintiffs submitted a series of emails allegedly written by my client, Ms. Ross. These emails were presented as evidence of coercion and fraud. However, digital forensics tell a different story. Mr. Anthony Green, a certified IT specialist, has analyzed the metadata of these emails. Anthony stepped forward, nerves visible for a moment before confidence settled over him. He pointed to the screen. Notice here the emails dated March 15th were actually created on April 3rd. That's impossible if they were sent in March. And the IP address doesn't trace back to Ms. Ross's homeschool or even this state. It routes through a proxy server located in Nevada. In other words, someone fabricated these emails. Gasps echoed in the gallery. The judge leaned forward. Are you certain? Yes, Your Honor, Anthony replied. The digital footprint is undeniable. Whoever forged these left behind their fingerprints. Rachel continued. Next, the contract presented by the plaintiffs. She held up a blown-up image. They claimed this document bore Richard Ross's signature transferring assets under duress. But when we compared it to legitimate contracts signed years earlier, she gestured and Anthony overlaid the images on the projector we found. The signature was pixel-perfect, identical. Not similar identical. A copy-and-paste forgery. The screen showed the two signatures stacked. The jury leaned in, eyes narrowing. Even from the back row, the duplication was unmistakable. And finally, Rachel said, her voice rising, notice the date font on this contract. It is Calibri, a font not available in word processors until 2000. Richard Ross signed his will in 2005. This contract could not have existed then. It is a modern fabrication. The room erupted. Caro jumped to his feet, sputtering. This is outrageous, a stunt. Enough, Judge Harrison barked, slamming his gavel. Sit down, Mr. Caro. I watched as my mother's hand twitched, her perfect composure cracking. Michael's jaw clenched, a flicker of panic crossing his face. Sophie dropped her tissue, her eyes darting toward the cameras as if calculating how her followers might spin this. Rachel wasn't finished. She opened my grandmother's notebook, laying it gently on the podium. Your Honor, this journal was maintained by Dorothy Bennett, the decedent's mother-in-law. It documents business dealings, contracts, and most importantly, Richard Ross's repeated statements that he wished Camille Ross to inherit controlling interest in the farm and company. Mrs. Bennett feared manipulation from other family members and preserved these records to protect her granddaughter. The judge took the notebook, flipping through the pages, his brow furrowed. These appear authentic. They are, Your Honor, Rachel said. Handwriting experts have verified Dorothy Bennett's script. And this, she lifted the sealed envelope, is her sworn statement, notarized before her death, attesting that Richard Ross's will was executed freely and intentionally with full clarity of mind. For a long moment, the room was silent. Even the cameras stopped flashing. Then the judge looked up, his eyes hard. Mr. Caro, do you have a response? Caro floundered, his polished facade slipping. Your Honor, we question the chain of custody. Chain of custody, Rachel snapped. When your clients submitted forged documents, routed fake emails, and lied under oath, their chain of custody is fraud itself. The judge's gavel struck like thunder. Order. He turned to my family. Mrs. Ross, Mr. Ross. Ms. Ross, do you understand the severity of submitting falsified evidence to this court? My mother's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Michael stared at the table silent. Sophie let out a choked sob, but no tears came this time. The judge's voice cut through the tension. I will not allow this courtroom to be turned into a circus of lies. The evidence presented by the defense is compelling and credible. The plaintiffs have not only failed to prove coercion, they have exposed themselves to charges of fraud and perjury. The gallery erupted again, but this time the whispers were different. I caught fragments. She was telling the truth all along. The siblings lied. Disgraceful. For the first time in weeks, the weight on my chest lifted. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. When the world calls you a liar, let the evidence speak for you. And it had. The gavel's echo hadn't faded before the consequences began unraveling. Court officers escorted my siblings and mother from the chamber for questioning their once proud figures crumbling under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sophie tried to hide her face behind her phone, but cameras caught every angle. Michael barked at reporters, his voice cracking with desperation. My mother walked stiffly, her dignity dissolving into brittle silence. By evening, headlines blazed across every news outlet: Ross family accused of fraud in inheritance battle. Emails forged contract. Fake courtroom, bombshell rocks, community. Neighbors who had once whispered behind my back now spoke of shame and betrayal, but not mine. Their condemnation shifted to the very people who had tried to bury me. Social media turned savage. Sophie's influencer brand built on curated perfection crumbled overnight. Sponsors dropped her within hours, citing integrity concerns. The same followers who once flooded her posts with adoration now filled the comments with venom. How could you lie about your own sister? Fraud is not fashionable. Sophie. Her apology livestream drew more ridicule than sympathy, the chat scrolling faster than she could blink. Michael's real estate firm bled clients. Longtime partners severed contracts unwilling to risk association with fraud. For years, he had strutted through town Rolex flashing handshake polished. Now his name was poison. I overheard one agent at a cafe saying he built his empire on a smile and his father's money without that he's nothing. And my mother, Margaret Ross, the woman who had carried herself as matriarch, untouchable, unimpeachable, was suddenly the subject of pity and disdain. Church members avoided her pew. Friends whispered that her obsession with appearances had blinded her. One local paper even ran an op-ed titled "The Fragility of a Golden Pedestal," dissecting how favoritism breeds ruin. For a woman who had thrived on reputation, it was a death blow more brutal than any jail sentence could provide. Meanwhile, Rachel filed motions for sanctions. Perjury charges loomed. Fraudulent evidence meant possible jail time for Caro as well. I watched him on the courthouse steps, sweat beading his forehead as he muttered about misunderstandings. His career, once untouchable, was now under the microscope of the state bar. But beyond the legal fallout, there was the quieter justice I hadn't expected: the shifting of voices. Leah, the friend who had once doubted me, showed up at my door with tears in her eyes. I was wrong, Camille. I let their lies get in my head. I'm so sorry. She wasn't the only one. Colleagues reached out apologizing for their distance. Parents wrote letters asking me to return to teaching. Slowly, the isolation that had suffocated me began to break apart, replaced by cautious trust. Still, the damage lingered. The betrayal had carved wounds that no apology could stitch closed. I would never forget the sight of my mother's hand on Michael's shoulder while she painted me as a villain. I would never forget Sophie's crocodile tears, her voice trembling as she condemned me for things I hadn't done. Forgiveness was not a gift I could offer. Yet I also refused to let bitterness define me. I had seen what bitterness did. It twisted, corroded, turned people into liars willing to sacrifice blood for greed. That would not be my legacy. One evening, after the storm of media attention began to quiet, I drove to my father's farm. The autumn air was crisp, the fields stretching golden under the fading sun. I walked the rows of corn and soybeans, the land he had loved, the land my grandmother had fought to protect for me. For the first time, I felt not like an intruder in my own family, but like a rightful heir. The farm was mine. The company was mine. My name, once smeared, had been restored, and though my family had fallen, I was still standing. But this was not the end. Justice had been served in the courtroom, yes, but my story was still being written. The weeks following the trial unfolded like a slow dawn after a violent storm. Each morning I woke with the same disbelief it was over. The lies had been dismantled, the evidence had spoken, and for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't defined by my family's shadow. Instead, I was standing on my own name, my own truth. The community that once whispered behind my back now greeted me differently. When I walked into the grocery store, people no longer turned away. They nodded, some even smiled. An older woman touched my arm at the checkout counter and said, "My dear, I hope you know how proud your grandmother would be." I carried her words with me like a blessing. At school, the board formally invited me back. They wanted me to return as a teacher, but also offered me a new position, curriculum lead for literature and ethics. "You've lived through something our students can learn from," the superintendent said. "You can teach them that truth matters even when it's painful." Standing in that office, I realized I didn't just want to return to the classroom. I wanted to use my voice for more. I accepted the role, not only because it was an honor, but because it felt like a bridge between who I had been, quiet, Camille, the invisible daughter, and who I had become. Someone who had faced down lies in a courtroom and refused to break. The farm and company, now legally mine, became another chapter of responsibility. I didn't sell them, though. Many advised me to. Instead, I hired local managers who respected the land, who wanted to run the business with integrity. It wasn't about building an empire. It was about preserving what my father had built, what my grandmother had protected. I visited often, walking the fields, breathing in the earth's quiet strength. Those acres became more than inheritance. They were a living reminder that resilience takes root when nurtured. As for my family, the fallout was permanent. Michael avoided me completely. His arrogance turned into shame. Sophie reached out once with a half-hearted message. We should talk, but I never responded. My mother sent no words at all. The silence between us became its own kind of closure. I realized I didn't need their apologies to move forward. Their absence was a wound, yes, but it was also freedom. Rachel and Anthony remained in my life as more than allies. Rachel became a mentor of sorts, reminding me often that justice is never a single moment, but a series of choices. Anthony, once my student, became my colleague in a way. Together, we spoke at community forums about digital literacy, about how evidence can be twisted and how to fight back. People listened. Survivors of fraud, of family betrayal, of false accusations came forward with their stories, and in those rooms, I found a chosen family that understood. But perhaps the most profound change came in my own heart. For so long, I had lived under the belief that being quiet meant being weak. My family had exploited my silence, twisted it into invisibility. Yet in the end, it was silence, patient, deliberate, that gave me strength. I didn't scream in court. I didn't lash out. I let the evidence, the truth, roar on my behalf. And it was louder than any accusation. One autumn evening, I returned to my grandmother's grave. The farm stretched wide behind me, the sky streaked with orange and violet. I knelt, placing the leather notebook and the now empty envelope on the stone. "You were right," I whispered. Truth did surface, and I'm still standing. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen by myself most of all. When people ask me now what I learned from the trial, I tell them, this family can betray you, the world can turn its back, but integrity has a way of outlasting the noise. Evidence never blinks, truth never dies, and silence, when chosen, can be the loudest weapon of all. I walked away from that grave not as the overlooked daughter or the maligned sister, but as Camille Ross, teacher, heir, survivor, and advocate. My story wasn't one of ruin, but of renewal. And if there was one message I wanted others to take from it, it was this. You don't have to be loud to be strong, and you don't have to be loved by your family to be worthy of love. The storm had passed, the sky was clear, and for the first time, my life was truly mine.